A dance hall in Orange, New Jersey. The year is 1917. The music is playing. Ragtime. The sound of a country that doesn't yet know it's about to be transformed by war. Young couples spin across the floor, laughing, flirting, full of the reckless energy of youth. And then a young woman walks in, and the room falls silent. In the dim light of the dance hall, she is glowing. Her dress sparkles with an ethereal, ghostly luminescence, a soft green-white shimmer that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Her lips shine, her fingernails gleam like tiny moons. Even her hair seems dusted with starlight. She is beautiful. She is otherworldly. She looks like something from a fairy tale, a creature made of moonbeams and magic. She is dying, but she doesn't know it yet. The other factory girls laugh and call out to her. They recognize her from work, from the dial painting studio where they all spend their days. They all glow too, though perhaps not as brightly as she does tonight. She must have been working hard, they think. She must have painted hundreds of watch dials today. They call themselves the Ghost Girls, and they wear their radiance like a badge of honor. They paint the luminous substance on their teeth to surprise their boyfriends with glowing smiles. They dust it in their hair for parties. They apply it to their eyelids like expensive cosmetics. Why not? The company tells them it's perfectly safe, healthy even. Good for the complexion. They are the luckiest girls in town. Good jobs, good pay, 3 times what a seamstress makes. Clean work in bright modern studios, nothing like the grimy textile mills where their mothers labored. They work with radium, the miracle element that scientists say will cure anything from cancer to impotence. They are touched by the future. What they don't know, what no one is telling them, is that every time they lick their brushes, every time they swallow a microscopic flake of that luminous paint, they are taking radium into their bodies. And radium doesn't leave. It mimics calcium. It settles into their bones like a patient predator, and it waits. Within a few years, these glowing girls will start to die. Their teeth will fall out one by one, leaving holes that refuse to heal. Their jaws will crumble, literally disintegrate, until pieces of bone come loose in their hands. Their legs will break beneath them as they walk. Their spines will collapse. They will waste away to living skeletons, too weak to stand, watching their own bodies betray them in ways that no doctor can explain. And when they try to hold someone accountable, when they try to tell the world what was done to them, the company that poisoned them will call them liars. It will call them hysterics. It will spread rumours that they died of shameful diseases, that they were loose women who brought this on themselves. It will hire scientists to manufacture doubt and lawyers to delay justice until the women are dead. It will do everything in its power to silence them before the truth can come out. This is not a story about an accident. This is not a story about ignorance or the unfortunate side effects of a new technology. This is a story about a crime committed in broad daylight, with full knowledge by men who did the math and decided that the lives of young women were worth less than their quarterly profits. But it is also a story about courage, because the Radium girls did not go quietly into their graves. Dying in unimaginable pain, with their own bodies rotting from within, they fought, they sued, they testified, they refused to be silenced, and they won. Not for themselves, it was too late for that. but for every worker who came after them. For every person who has ever been protected by occupational safety laws. For every victim of corporate negligence who found justice in a courtroom. The Radium girls lit the way. They glowed in the dark, and the light they left behind still shines today. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark histories deserve to be remembered, if you believe the dead deserve to have their stories told, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we will enter the dial painting studios of early 20th century America. We will meet the young women who took these jobs with hope in their hearts, who dreamed of weddings and families and bright futures. We will watch as the miracle of radium becomes a curse, as their bodies fail them in horrifying ways, as the company that poisoned them wages war against the truth. And we will follow their battle, their desperate, courageous, agonizing battle against one of the most callous corporate cover-ups in American history. This is the story of the Ghost Girls, the women who glowed in the dark, the women who lit the way for workers' rights in America and paid for it with their lives. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand how young American women came to be poisoned by their own lipstick and paintbrushes, we must first travel to Paris, to a cramped and freezing laboratory where two scientists were about to change the world. The year is 1898. Marie Sklodowska. Curie and her husband Pierre have been working for months on a puzzle that has baffled the scientific community. Certain minerals, particularly a black, tar-like ore called pitchblende, emit mysterious rays that can fog photographic plates even through thick paper. Henri Becquerel discovered this strange phenomenon 2 years earlier, but no one can explain it. Where is this energy coming from? What is producing it? Marie Curie suspects the answer lies within the ore itself. She believes there is an element hidden inside pitchblende, an element no one has ever seen, that is responsible for these mysterious emissions. To prove it, she must isolate it. She must separate this hypothetical element from the thousands of other compounds in the ore. The work is backbreaking. She processes tons of pitchblende by hand, working in a converted shed that is freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. She stirs massive vats of boiling chemicals. Her hands become cracked and burned. Her notebooks are stained with acid. And then, one night, she and Pierre enter the darkened laboratory and see it for the first time. In a small glass dish sits a tiny quantity of something that glows with an eerie blue-green light. It is beautiful, beautiful in a way that stops the breath. The glow is soft but steady, pulsing gently like something alive. The Curies stand there in the darkness, transfixed, bathed in the light of something the world has never seen before. They call it radium, from the Latin word for ray. The scientific world is electrified by the discovery. Radium seems to violate the fundamental laws of physics as they are understood in 1898. It emits energy constantly, continuously, without any apparent fuel source. It generates heat. It glows. It can burn skin and destroy tissue. And it does all of this from within itself, endlessly, as if it has captured a piece of the sun. Marie Curie will win 2 Nobel Prizes for her work, the first person ever to win the award twice. She will become one of the most celebrated scientists in history. She will also die of aplastic anemia, her bone marrow destroyed by decades of radiation exposure. Her personal effects, her notebooks, her cookbooks, even her furniture, are so contaminated that they are kept in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Anyone who wishes to view them must sign a liability waiver and wear protective clothing, but all of that is decades away. In 1898, radium is pure wonder, pure magic, a miracle, and everyone wants a piece of it. In the early years of the 20th century, radium became the wonder drug to end all wonder drugs. The reasoning seemed logical, even scientific. Radium emitted energy. Energy was life. Disease was a lack of energy, a failure of the body's vital forces. Therefore, radium must be good for you. The more you consumed, the healthier you would become. This logic, which seems insane to us now, was embraced by doctors, scientists, and the general public with enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. Radium was not merely a medicine, it was a miracle. It was the future. It was going to cure everything. The products that flooded the market read like a fever dream. There was Radithor, a radium-infused water sold in small bottles and marketed as a cure for impotence, arthritis, mental illness, and dozens of other ailments. A cure for the living dead, the advertisements promised. Thousands of people drank it daily, sometimes dozens of bottles a week, confident that they were investing in their health. There were radium suppositories for male vigor, small radioactive pellets designed to be inserted rectally, promising to restore sexual vitality to aging men. There were radium-infused face creams that claimed to restore youthful skin, radium toothpaste that promised brighter smiles, radium hair tonic that would prevent baldness. There was radium bread, radium butter, radium chocolate. There were radium-lined jockstraps for men who wanted to irradiate their most sensitive areas. There were radioactive bathhouses where the wealthy could soak in radium-laced waters, convinced they were absorbing health through their skin. Children were given radium tablets. Babies were soothed with radium-laced pacifiers. Pregnant women were encouraged to consume radium for the health of their unborn children. One of the most enthusiastic consumers was a wealthy socialite named Eben Byers. Byers was a famous athlete and playboy who began drinking Radithor in 1927 after a doctor recommended it for an injured arm. He loved the stuff. He drank it religiously, an estimated 1,400 bottles over the next 3 years. By 1931, his jaw had literally fallen off. The radium had destroyed his skull from within. Holes appeared in his head. Abscesses formed. His brain was visible through the lesions. When he died in 1932, the Wall Street Journal ran a headline that would have been darkly comic if it weren't so horrifying. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. But in the early days, in 1910, 1915, 1917, none of this was known. Radium was magic. Radium was the future. And American entrepreneurs were determined to find new ways to sell it. In 1914, the world went to war. The trenches of France and Belgium became charnel houses, industrial slaughter on a scale humanity had never imagined. Millions of young men hunched in muddy ditches, waiting for the whistle that would send them over the top into machine gun fire. The war dragged on, year after year, consuming lives like firewood. And in that darkness, a specific need emerged. Soldiers needed to tell time at night. It sounds trivial, but in the trenches, It was a matter of life and death. Coordinated attacks required precise timing. Artillery barrages were scheduled to the minute. A soldier who struck a match to check his watch at the wrong moment could draw enemy fire, could reveal his position to snipers, could get himself and everyone around him killed. The military needed watches that could be read in complete darkness. They needed instrument panels that glowed. They needed gun sights that shimmered. They needed radium. In 1917, a company called the United States Radium Corporation opened its doors in Orange, New Jersey. The company had developed a special paint called Undark, a mixture of radium, zinc sulfide, and adhesive that glowed in the dark indefinitely. The glow was soft but steady, visible in complete blackness, perfect for military applications. The military contracts poured in, then the commercial contracts, watch companies, clock manufacturers, instrument makers. Everyone wanted luminous dials, and US Radium was happy to provide them. But applying the paint was a problem. The numbers on a watch dial are tiny, some barely larger than a pinhead. Painting them required extraordinary precision. The brushes had to be fine, the lines crisp, the work delicate. Machines couldn't do it. The technology didn't exist. This was work that required human hands, specifically small, nimble fingers that could manipulate the tiny brushes with accuracy. The company needed workers. Specifically, they needed workers who could be paid less than men, who wouldn't demand the protections that unionized male workers might expect, who would accept the work conditions without asking too many questions. They needed young women. The advertisements appeared in newspapers across Newark and Orange, New Jersey. Girls wanted high pay, clean work, no experience necessary. For young women from working-class families, daughters of immigrants, girls who expected to spend their lives in textile mills or as domestic servants, the ads seemed too good to be true. The pay was extraordinary, up to $20 a week, sometimes more for fast workers. That was 3 times what a seamstress earned, 4 times what a laundry worker could expect. It was life-changing money. The work conditions seemed even better. Unlike the textile factories with their deafening machinery, their lint-choked air, their brutal heat in summer and bitter cold in winter, the dial-painting studios were clean and bright. The women worked at individual stations, each with her own workspace, her own brushes, her own supplies. It felt almost artistic. It felt modern. It felt like the future. Fathers bragged about their daughters' jobs at the radium factory. Mothers counted the money coming in and dreamed of hope chests, of weddings, of grandchildren. The girls themselves felt lucky, chosen even. They had escaped the drudgery that awaited most working-class women. They were special. And the radium itself was glamorous. It glowed. It shimmered. The company told the new hires it was not only safe, but actually healthy. Good for the skin, good for the complexion. One supervisor allegedly told the girls that if they accidentally swallowed any of the paint, it would make their cheeks rosy. Another demonstrated the technique by putting her own brush in her mouth, showing the new workers there was nothing to fear. The women were young, some as young as 14 or 15, though most were in their late teens and early 20s. They came from Irish families, from Italian families, from German and Polish and Jewish families. They had names like Molly and Grace and Catherine and Quinta. They had dreams of marriage and children, of nice houses and better lives than their parents had known. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Among the first wave of dial painters in 1917 was a young woman named Grace Fryer. She was 18 years old, smart, practical, the kind of woman who saved her money and thought about the future. She lived with her family in Orange, just a short walk from the factory. When she heard about the dial painting jobs, she applied immediately. Grace was good at the work, fast and precise, her numbers crisp and clean. She took pride in her dials. She made friends with the other girls in the studio. She started saving for her future, putting away a little each week toward the life she planned to build. She didn't know that in 5 years, she wouldn't be able to walk. She didn't know that in 10 years, she would be standing in a courtroom, or rather, sitting, because standing would be impossible, fighting for her life against the company that had destroyed it. But first, she had to learn the technique. It was a simple 3-step process that her supervisors demonstrated on her very first day. 3 steps that would kill hundreds of women. 3 steps that would change American labor law forever. They called it lip dip paint. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. A dial painter would pick up her fine-tipped brush. She would dip it into the small pot of luminous paint at her workstation, the paint that glowed with that beautiful, eerie radium light. And then she would bring the brush to her lips, placing it in her mouth and using her tongue and lips to shape the bristles into a perfect point. Lip, dip, paint. Then she would paint a number or a mark on the watch dial, and the process would begin again. Lip, dip, paint. Over and over, 250 times a day, sometimes more. Each watch dial had 12 numbers, plus minute markers, plus hour and minute hands. A fast worker could complete more than 200 dials in a single shift. The company insisted on this technique. The lip pointing produced the finest lines, the crispest numbers. It used the least amount of paint, which was crucial because radium was expensive, worth more than gold per gram. Every flake that fell on the floor was money lost. The company accountants tracked the paint consumption obsessively, watching for waste. But the radium that went into the girls' mouths, that didn't show up on any ledger. That was free. The mathematics of the poisoning were simple. Each time a worker lip-pointed her brush, she deposited a microscopic amount of radium paint on her lips, her tongue, her gums. A tiny amount, invisible, tasteless. Individually, nothing to worry about. But 250 times a day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, the doses accumulated. And radium doesn't leave the body. Unlike most poisons, which are eventually filtered out through the liver and kidneys, radium mimics calcium. The body doesn't recognize it as foreign. It absorbs the radium and deposits it directly into the bones, where it stays forever, emitting radiation continuously, destroying tissue from within. Some of the dial painters swallowed so much radium paint that their breath glowed in the dark. When they exhaled in a darkened room, you could see the luminescence. They thought it was funny. They thought it was glamorous. They had no idea they were watching their own death sentences. The dial painting studios were, in their way, happy places. The women who worked there formed genuine friendships, bonds forged over shared lunches and whispered confidences and the daily rhythm of the work. They gossiped about boyfriends and complained about their mothers. They celebrated each other's engagements and weddings and pregnancies. They competed too. Who could paint the most dials? Who had the steadiest hand? Who could produce the crispest numbers? The older women mentored the younger ones, teaching them the tricks of the trade. helping them improve their speed and accuracy. There was a hierarchy, as there is in any workplace, but it was generally friendly. They were all in this together, all benefiting from these miraculous jobs that had dropped into their lives like gifts from heaven. And then there was the glow. The radium paint got everywhere. It dusted their hands and their faces. It settled on their clothes and in their hair. By the end of a shift, the dial painters were luminescent, covered in a fine, invisible powder that only revealed itself in darkness. They embraced it. They painted their fingernails with the luminous paint so they sparkled at dance halls. They dusted it on their faces like expensive face powder. They painted their teeth so their smiles would glow in the dark, a trick to surprise their boyfriends, to stand out at parties, to be memorable and magical and different. They called themselves the Ghost Girls or the Shining Girls. When they walked home after a late shift, they left glowing footprints on the sidewalk. When they undressed for bed, their nightgowns shimmered. They were creatures from a fairy tale, touched by something extraordinary, marked for a special destiny. They did not know that destiny was death. Among the hundreds of young women who passed through the dial painting studios, certain names stand out. Women whose stories would become central to the fight for justice, whose courage would change American law. Molly Magia was beautiful and vivacious, the life of any party. She started at the Orange Studio in 1917, when she was just 19 years old. She was known for her smile, her laughter, her easy way with people. The other girls loved her. She was one of those rare people who made everyone around her feel special, feel noticed, feel alive. She would be the first to die, and after her death, the company would destroy her reputation to cover up what had killed her. Grace Fryer was practical, where Molly was effervescent. She was the planner, the organizer, the one who thought things through. She had a sharp mind and an iron will. When things went wrong, when the horror began, she would be the one who refused to accept the company's lies. She would be the one who spent years searching for justice, who never gave up, who fought until she couldn't fight anymore. Catherine Schaub was Grace's cousin, hired on Grace's recommendation. Catherine was 15 when she started, young even by the standards of the studio. She trusted Grace. She trusted the company. She lip-pointed her brush hundreds of thousands of times, building up a reservoir of poison in her bones that would eventually destroy her. Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice were sisters, one of several pairs of sisters who worked in the studios. They were close, as sisters are, and they shared everything: their lunches, their gossip, their brushes, their fate. They would sit beside each other in the courtroom years later, both of them dying, fighting together as they had worked together. Edna Hussman would become crucial evidence long after her death. Her radium-riddled body, exhumed decades later, would provide scientists with the data they needed to understand exactly what radium does to human bone. These women were not statistics. They were not symbols. They were people, with hopes, with dreams, with families who loved them, and futures they would never see. They were young women who went to work one day and never came home the same. Here is the fact that transforms this story from tragedy to crime. The United States Radium Corporation knew that radium was dangerous. They had known since before they opened their doors. As early as 1901, 16 years before Grace Fryer started lip-pointing her brush, scientists had documented the dangers of radiation exposure. Marie Curie herself had burns on her hands from handling radium. Pierre Curie had deliberately exposed his own arm to radium to document the damage it caused. By 1906, the first radiation-induced deaths were being reported in scientific literature. The executives and scientists at US Radium were not ignorant of this research. They were well-educated men, trained in chemistry and physics. They read the scientific journals. They knew what radium could do, and they took precautions for themselves. In the company laboratories, where chemists handled concentrated radium, the safety measures were elaborate. Workers wore lead aprons. They used ivory-tipped tongs to manipulate radium samples, never touching them with bare hands. Lead screens separated workers from radiation sources. There were strict protocols against ingestion or inhalation. But in the dial painting studios, where young women handled radium all day, every day, nothing, no warnings, no protective equipment, no instructions to avoid putting the brushes in their mouths. The women worked in their street clothes, ate their lunches at their workstations, went home covered in radium dust. When asked later why the safety protocols weren't extended to the dial painters, company officials would claim ignorance. The paint was diluted, they said. The amounts were tiny. They didn't know it was dangerous. But internal documents, uncovered during later litigation, would tell a different story. The company knew. They knew from the beginning. They simply decided that the lives of young working-class women weren't worth the cost of protecting. The cost-benefit analysis was brutally simple. Lead aprons and proper equipment would cost money. Training workers in safe handling techniques would slow production. Installing ventilation systems and decontamination facilities would require capital investment. Dead dial painters, on the other hand, could be replaced. There were always more young women looking for work. The supply was essentially infinite. So the company made its choice, and the women kept lip-pointing their brushes, kept swallowing microscopic doses of radium, kept building up poison in their bones, completely unaware that they were being sacrificed for quarterly profits. By 1920, strange things had begun to happen. The problems started small, so small they were easy to dismiss. A woman would notice her teeth becoming loose, wobbling in her gums like a child's baby teeth. Another would have a tooth pulled by her dentist and find that the hole refused to heal, remaining an open wound for weeks, then months. Someone would develop a toothache that no amount of dental work could fix. One by one, the dial painters began visiting their doctors with complaints that didn't make sense. Fatigue so profound they could barely get out of bed. Aching joints. Mysterious pains that seemed to migrate through their bodies, settling first in their jaw, then their legs, then their spine. The doctors were baffled. These were young, healthy women. They should have been in the prime of their lives. The symptoms didn't match any known disease. Some doctors blamed the women themselves, suggesting they were hypochondriacs or hysterics, or simply looking for attention. Molly Magia was among the first to get seriously ill. In 1921, she began complaining of severe tooth pain. Her dentist examined her and found nothing obviously wrong, but Molly insisted something was terribly, terribly wrong. He pulled a tooth. The socket didn't heal. Instead, it became an open, weeping sore. She went back. He pulled another tooth, same result, then another and another. Each extraction left a wound that wouldn't close, that seemed to spread, that began to eat into the bone itself. Something was wrong with Molly's jaw. Something was destroying it from within. But what? How? The doctors had no answers. They tried treatments for infection, for ulcers, for every condition they could think of. Nothing worked. The company doctor examined her. He pronounced her fine, perhaps a dental infection, nothing to worry about. He sent her home, but Molly was not fine, and she was only the first. The shadow of death was beginning to fall over the dial painting studios. The Ghost Girls didn't know it yet, but their glowing was about to take on a terrible new meaning. Molly Maggia's death was a horror that belongs in nightmares. By early 1922, her jaw had become a landscape of wounds. The sores had spread, connecting to each other, exposing the bone beneath. Her gums had turned grey, then black. The smell was unbearable. The smell of rotting flesh, of death already claiming her even as she lived. She could barely eat. Every attempt to chew sent waves of agony through her face. She lost weight rapidly, her body consuming itself. She stopped going out, stopped seeing friends. She sat in her room, waiting for the pain to subside, but the pain never subsided. It only grew worse. Her dentist, Dr. Joseph Kneff, had never seen anything like it. The bone of her jaw seemed to be dying, necrotizing, the medical term would be, crumbling away like chalk. He tried to treat her, but every intervention made things worse. When he probed her mouth, pieces of bone came loose. When he tried to remove diseased tissue, he found that the disease had spread further than he could see. In one terrible moment that Kneff would remember for the rest of his life, he attempted to examine what remained of Molly's jaw. When he applied gentle pressure, her jawbone crumbled in his hands. It didn't break. It disintegrated, like sandstone exposed to water. He found himself holding pieces of her own skeleton. He removed what was left. There was nothing else he could do. By the summer of 1922, Molly's entire lower jaw was gone. Most of her upper jaw had followed. Her face had collapsed inward, a hollow where her smile used to be. She could not speak clearly. She could not eat solid food. She existed on liquids when she could bear to swallow at all. The pain was constant, relentless, beyond anything that morphine could touch. She was 24 years old. On September 12, 1922, Molly Maggia died. The official cause of death, recorded by the doctor who performed her autopsy, was syphilis. Syphilis. The word hung over Molly's grave like a curse. In 1922, syphilis was not merely a disease, it was a moral judgment. It was the disease of prostitutes, of loose women, of the underclass. A nice girl from a good family did not get syphilis. To be diagnosed with syphilis was to be branded, marked forever as someone who had transgressed the bounds of decent society. There was no evidence that Molly Maggia had syphilis. No blood tests confirmed it. No symptoms consistent with syphilitic infection had been documented during her illness. The disease that killed her had begun in her jaw and spread through her bones, a pattern completely unlike syphilis, which is a systemic infection that spreads through the bloodstream. But syphilis was the diagnosis that appeared on her death certificate. And that diagnosis did not come from nowhere. The company needed Molly Maggia to have died of syphilis. By 1922, the executives at US Radium were becoming concerned. Molly was not the only dial painter getting sick. Other women were reporting similar symptoms: loose teeth, unexplained pain, fatigue, wounds that wouldn't heal. If anyone connected these illnesses to the radium paint, the company would face devastating consequences: lawsuits, regulatory investigations, the loss of lucrative military and commercial contracts. The syphilis diagnosis solved multiple problems at once. First, it provided an alternative explanation for Molly's death, an explanation that had nothing to do with the company or its products. She hadn't died of radium poisoning. She had died of a shameful disease that she brought upon herself. Second, it silenced Molly's family. What grieving family would publicize a syphilis death? The Maggias were a respectable Italian-American family. They would not want Molly's name dragged through the mud, would not want her memory associated with prostitution and moral failure. They would stay quiet, and the truth would be buried with Molly. Third, it deterred other sick workers from coming forward. Who would want to be examined, to risk being diagnosed with syphilis like poor Molly? Better to suffer in silence than to face that kind of public humiliation. The lie was perfect in its cruelty. It protected the company not just by providing cover for one death, but by poisoning the well for any future accusations. From now on, any dial painter who got sick would have to wonder, would they say I have syphilis too? Molly Maggia, vivacious, beloved Molly, who had made everyone around her smile, was not just killed by the company that employed her. She was slandered by them in death, her reputation destroyed to protect their profits. She would not be the last. After Molly's death, the illnesses began to multiply. One by one, the dial painters began falling sick with the same impossible symptoms. Young women in their 20s, women who should have been at the peak of health, found their bodies failing in ways that no doctor could explain. Hazel Vincent Cusa developed the same jaw problems as Molly. Her teeth loosened and fell out. Her jawbone began to deteriorate. She underwent surgery after surgery, but nothing stopped the progression. She died in 1924, her face a ruin. Irene Rudolph discovered that her blood would not clot. When she had dental work, the bleeding wouldn't stop. For weeks, she bled slowly, steadily, the life draining out of her drop by drop. Her bone marrow, the factory that produces blood cells, had been destroyed by the radium she had swallowed years before. She bled to death, slowly, over the course of weeks. Sarah Malifer watched her spine collapse. The vertebrae, weakened by radium, crumbled one by one. She became paralyzed before she died, trapped in a body that was destroying itself from within. Marguerite Carlo was one of the faster painters, which meant she had lip-pointed her brush more often, swallowed more paint, absorbed more radium. Her illness progressed quickly. She died in agony, her jaw rotted away, her bones so fragile they broke at the slightest pressure. The medical details of radium poisoning are almost too horrible to describe, but the women endured them, and so we must bear witness. Radium jaw, the condition that killed Molly and so many others, occurs because radium settles preferentially in bone tissue, especially in areas with high bone turnover. The jaw, which is constantly being remodeled as we eat and speak, accumulates radium faster than almost any other bone in the body. Once the radium is in place, it emits alpha particles continuously, tiny, high-energy projectiles that tear through cell walls, shredding DNA, killing tissue. The bone dies. The medical term is osteonecrosis, literally bone death. The dead bone cannot fight infection. Bacteria move in. Abscesses form. The jaw literally rots while the patient is still alive. The symptoms progress in a terrible sequence. Loose teeth, then tooth loss, then sores that won't heal, then exposed bone, then crumbling bone, then pieces of the jaw coming loose and falling out. Some women could remove chunks of their own jawbone with their fingers. Some found bone fragments in their food when they tried to eat. Some watched their faces collapse inward as the structural support of their skulls disintegrated. The pain was beyond description, a constant grinding agony that no medication could touch. But the jaw was not the only target. Bone fractures became common among the dial painters. The radium weakened all of their bones, not just their jaws. Women's legs broke while they were walking. Spines collapsed. Hips shattered from the simple act of standing up. A stumble that would have been nothing for a healthy person became a catastrophic injury for a radium girl. Anemia was another consequence. Radium destroyed bone marrow, the tissue that produces red blood cells. Without functioning marrow, the women became ghosts in truth, pale, exhausted, unable to recover from even minor injuries. A cut that would heal in days for a healthy person might bleed for weeks. A cold might turn into pneumonia. The body's ability to repair itself simply stopped working. And because radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, the damage continued indefinitely. Every radium atom the women had swallowed was still there, still emitting radiation, still destroying tissue. There was no treatment. There was no cure. There was only slow, agonizing death. Grace Fryer had left the dial painting studio in 1920. She had found a better-paying job as a bank teller, respectable work, cleaner work, work that seemed like a step up in the world. She thought she had moved on from the radium factory, that it was just a chapter in her past, a stepping stone to better things. She was wrong. In 1922, Grace began experiencing pain in her feet. It was vague at first, a dull ache that she attributed to standing all day at the bank. She bought new shoes. She rested when she could. The pain continued. Then the pain spread to her back. Her spine began to hurt, a deep grinding pain that made it difficult to sit, to stand, to lie down, to find any position that provided relief. She went to doctors. They ran tests. They found nothing. They told her it was probably muscular, probably stress, probably nothing to worry about. By 1923, Grace could barely walk. Her spine was deteriorating, though she didn't know it yet. Vertebrae that should have been solid bone were becoming porous, honeycomb, riddled with tiny holes where the radium had destroyed tissue. Every step sent jolts of pain through her body, and then her jaw started hurting. Grace was not stupid. She read the newspapers. She heard the gossip. She knew that Molly Maggia had died, officially of syphilis. But Grace had known Molly, had worked beside her, and she knew that Molly was no prostitute. She knew that other dial painters were getting sick, that some had died. She began to connect the dots. She started reaching out to other former dial painters. She found Catherine Scholb, her own cousin, who was now experiencing similar symptoms. She found Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice, the sisters, both ill. She found Edna Hussman, barely able to walk. They compared notes. They shared their medical histories. And they realized, with growing horror, that they were all dying of the same thing. The radium had killed them. The jobs that they had been told were safe, that they had been told were good for them, had poisoned them. And the company had known. The company had known all along. Grace Fryer decided to do something about it. In 1924, a young medical examiner named Harrison Stanford Martland became interested in the dial painter cases. Martland was the chief medical examiner for Essex County, New Jersey, a methodical, scientifically minded man who had built his reputation on careful forensic work. When he heard about the strange deaths among the dial painters, his curiosity was piqued. Here was a medical mystery, young, healthy women dying of a condition that no one could explain. He began examining the sick women, conducting tests that had never been performed before. He brought radiation detection equipment to their bedsides. What he found was shocking. The women were radioactive. When Martland held a radiation detector near their bodies, it clicked and buzzed. When he tested their breath, the air they exhaled, it contained measurable amounts of radon, the radioactive gas produced by radium decay. Their very exhalations were poisonous. He developed a test to measure what he called radium body burden, the amount of radioactive material trapped in a person's bones. The numbers for the dial painters were staggering. Some had accumulated enough radium to fog photographic film from several feet away. Their skeletons had become radiation sources, constantly bombarding their own tissue with alpha particles. Martland published his findings. His conclusions were unequivocal. The dial painters had been poisoned by radium. The lip-pointing technique had introduced radioactive material directly into their bodies. The company's assurances of safety had been lies. The US Radium Corporation's response was immediate and predictable. They denied everything. Company executives dismissed Martland's findings as speculation. They hired their own scientists to produce studies showing that radium in small amounts was perfectly safe, beneficial even. They claimed the women must have been exposed to radiation somewhere else. They suggested the women were suffering from other conditions that had nothing to do with their work. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, a corporation with unlimited resources, political connections, and an army of lawyers. On the other, a group of dying women and a medical examiner with evidence that no one wanted to hear. Grace Fryer now had the proof she needed. She had a doctor who could testify to exactly what had been done to them. What she needed next was a lawyer, someone willing to take on one of the most powerful corporations in New Jersey, in a legal system that had never recognized radiation poisoning as an occupational disease. She would spend 2 years searching. Every attorney she approached turned her down. The company was too powerful. The case was too novel. The women were too sick. They might die before the trial even started. Taking the case would mean years of work with no guarantee of payment, while making an enemy of one of the most connected corporations in the state. "No, thank you," lawyer after lawyer said. "I can't help you. I'm sorry." And every month, another dial painter died. Grace Fryer was running out of time. Her own body was failing. She could feel the radium doing its work, feel her bones weakening, feel the pain spreading through her spine and jaw. But she refused to die in silence. The United States Radium Corporation did not simply ignore the dying women. It waged war against them. This was not negligence. This was not bureaucratic indifference. This was a calculated, deliberate, systematic campaign to discredit the victims, suppress the evidence, and escape any responsibility for the deaths the company had caused. The tactics were sophisticated, the execution was ruthless, and the moral bankruptcy was absolute. Medical manipulation was the first line of defense. Company doctors examined workers who complained of illness and pronounced them healthy, even as the women visibly deteriorated before their eyes. Diagnoses were falsified: syphilis, general infection, anemia of unknown origin, anything except radium poisoning. Doctors who might have testified for the workers were pressured, threatened, or bought off. The medical record was systematically corrupted to protect the company. Scientific disinformation was the second weapon. Company-funded scientists produced studies claiming that radium in small amounts was perfectly safe, beneficial even. These studies were methodologically suspect, designed to produce a predetermined conclusion, but they served their purpose. They created enough doubt, enough confusion, that the company could claim the science was unsettled. Legitimate researchers like Harrison Martland were attacked, their credentials questioned, their motives impugned. Legal warfare was the third and most potent tactic. The company's lawyers deployed every procedural trick in the book to delay justice. They filed motion after motion, demanded endless documentation, requested postponement after postponement. The goal was simple: delay the case until the plaintiffs were dead. Dead women can't testify. Dead women can't appear before juries. Dead women make poor sympathizers. The statute of limitations was weaponized with particular cynicism. Under New Jersey law at the time, workers had only 2 years from the date of injury to file a lawsuit. But when had the dial painters been injured? When they first swallowed radium? When they first developed symptoms? When they were finally diagnosed? The company's lawyers argued for the narrowest possible interpretation, trying to get the cases thrown out on procedural grounds before any evidence could be heard. Character assassination was the final weapon, and perhaps the cruelest. The syphilis diagnosis for Molly Maggia was not a one-time mistake. It was a template. Other sick women were implied to have loose morals, to have contracted shameful diseases, to have brought their suffering upon themselves. The unspoken message was clear. These women did this to themselves. They were not victims. They were not worthy of sympathy. They were fallen women, and their deaths were their own fault. When confronted with evidence that lip pointing was dangerous, the US Radium Corporation developed a defense so brazen it took the breath away. They claimed the women were never instructed to lip point at all. According to company officials, the dial painters had invented the technique themselves. Management knew nothing about it. If the women chose to put their brushes in their mouths, that was their own decision, a decision made without the company's knowledge or approval. This was a brazen, shameless lie. Lip pointing was standard company instruction, taught to every new worker by supervisors on their first day. There were dozens of witnesses, former workers, current workers, supervisors themselves, who had seen the technique demonstrated, who had been told to use it, who had watched others being trained. The lip-pointing technique was the reason the company used human workers instead of machines. No machine could produce the fine lines that a lip-pointed brush could achieve. But the company bet that no court would believe a bunch of sick, dying working-class women over respectable businessmen in suits. They bet that their lawyers could create enough doubt, sow enough confusion, that their version of events would prevail. For a while, it seemed like they might be right. Among the most insidious tactics the company employed was the use of supposedly independent consultants to manufacture scientific doubt. The most prominent of these was a man named Frederick Flynn. Flynn presented himself as an independent scientist from Columbia University, an objective expert with no financial stake in the outcome. He examined the dial painters and produced a report concluding that they were perfectly healthy. Radium was not responsible for their symptoms, he claimed. They probably had other conditions: phosphorus poisoning from matches, bacterial infections, hysteria. The women who were examined by Flynn did not know several crucial facts. They did not know that Flynn was being paid by US Radium. They did not know that his examinations were designed not to discover the truth, but to produce conclusions favorable to the company. They did not know that Flynn was not actually a medical doctor. He had no training in diagnosis, no qualifications to assess their conditions. Flynn's report was used for years to deny compensation to dying women. When workers applied for insurance benefits, Flynn's report was cited. When lawsuits were filed, Flynn's report was entered into evidence. When newspapers investigated the dial painter deaths, company spokesmen pointed to Flynn's report as proof that radium was safe. Years later, after the scandal had finally broken open, Flynn's deception would be exposed. But by then, many of the women he had examined, the women he had pronounced healthy, were dead. For 2 years, from 1925 to 1927, Grace Fryer searched for a lawyer. Her situation seemed impossible. She had evidence, Dr. Martland's tests proving that the dial painters were full of radium. She had witnesses, other workers who could testify to the lip-pointing technique. She had victims, a growing list of sick and dying women whose cases demonstrated the clear pattern of radium poisoning. But she did not have power. The US Radium Corporation had unlimited resources. It had connections to the political establishment. Its products were used by the military. Its executives knew politicians and judges. It had an army of lawyers, each one skilled in the dark arts of delay and obfuscation. Grace had nothing but the truth. And truth, she was discovering, was not worth much in a legal system designed to protect the powerful. Attorney after attorney turned her down. Some were sympathetic, but afraid of the company's power. Some were simply uninterested in a case that would take years of work with no guarantee of payment. Some looked at Grace, a dying woman who might not survive to see a verdict, and saw a losing proposition. "I'm sorry," they told her. "I can't help you." Every month, another dial painter died. Every month, Grace's own condition worsened. The radium was eating her spine, destroying her jaw, draining her strength. She knew she was running out of time, but she refused to give up. She refused to die quietly as the company wanted. She refused to let Molly's death and Hazel's death and all the other deaths go unanswered. And finally, in 1927, she found her champion. Raymond Berry was a young attorney with a small practice in Newark. He was idealistic, perhaps naively so, and he believed that the law should protect the powerless from the powerful. When Grace Fryer walked into his office and told him her story, he listened. He knew the case would be difficult. He knew the company had resources he couldn't match, lawyers who would bury him in paperwork, experts who would contradict his every argument. He knew some of his clients might die before the case was resolved. He took the case anyway. Berry agreed to represent Grace Fryer and 4 other women, Catherine Schaub, Edna Hussman, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice. Together, they would become known as the Radium Girls, a name that would soon be on the front page of every newspaper in America. Berry understood that his best weapon was not legal brilliance, but public sympathy. The company could delay proceedings indefinitely with procedural motions, but they could not control the court of public opinion. They could not prevent journalists from covering the story. They could not stop the American people from seeing, with their own eyes, what US Radium had done to these women. The case of the Radium girls was filed in 1927. The battle for justice and for public attention was about to begin. The company's lawyers, confident in their ability to delay justice until the plaintiffs were dead, prepared for a war of attrition. But something unexpected happened. The press got hold of the story, and the American public for the first time met the ghost girls, not as shimmering beauties at a dance hall, but as dying women demanding justice. The court of public opinion was about to convene, and its verdict would change everything. When the lawsuit became public in early 1928, it was as if someone had thrown open the windows of a dark room. The story had everything the newspapers loved: villains and victims, corporate greed and innocent suffering, life and death stakes, and a race against time. Reporters descended on Newark. Photographers captured images of the dying women. Headlines screamed about the Radium girls and the glowing death. 5 women dying from radium poisoning file suit, announced the New York World. The living dead, proclaimed the Newark Evening News. The story spread from New Jersey to New York to Chicago to San Francisco, picked up by wire services and reprinted in papers across the country. The contrast between the women and their employer was devastating. On one side, young women, some barely into their 20s, who should have been at the peak of life, getting married, having children, building futures. Instead, they could barely walk. Their jaws were bandaged. Their bodies were failing. They were visibly, obviously dying. On the other side, the US Radium Corporation, wealthy and prosperous, its executives healthy and well-fed, its lawyers sleek and confident. A company that had made fortunes selling radium products while denying any responsibility for the deaths those products had caused. The public sympathy was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across the country, expressing outrage at the company and support for the women. Politicians who had previously ignored the case suddenly discovered an interest in workers' rights. The pressure on US Radium intensified daily. For the first time, the company was facing something its lawyers couldn't defeat: the weight of public opinion. The courtroom scenes were wrenching. Grace Fryer took the stand and told her story. She could barely walk. She had to be helped to the witness chair, her spine so damaged that every step was agony. But her voice was steady and her eyes were clear as she described her years at the dial painting studio. She described the technique: lip, dip, paint. She described how the supervisors had demonstrated it, how she had been told the paint was safe, how she had swallowed it day after day, year after year, trusting the people who employed her. She described watching her friends get sick. She described Molly Maggia's death and the shameful syphilis lie that had been spread about her. She described her own symptoms: the pain that never stopped, the jaw that was deteriorating, the body that was betraying her. Catherine Schaub testified next. Her jaw had been partially removed. Surgical attempts to stop the spread of the radium necrosis. She spoke through the pain, through the disfigurement, her words clear and damning. But it was Quinta MacDonald's testimony that broke the courtroom. Quinta was too sick to sit up. She was carried into the courtroom on a stretcher, her body so weakened that she could barely lift her head. She testified lying down, her voice barely above a whisper, while reporters in the gallery wiped their eyes. Here was a woman who was literally dying before their eyes, who had dragged herself to court because she refused to let the company escape justice. Here was courage so profound it stopped the breath. The defense attorneys tried their standard tactics. They questioned the women's credibility. They suggested alternative explanations for their symptoms. They cited Frederick Flynn's fraudulent report as evidence that radium was safe. But in the glare of public attention, with dying women testifying before them, these arguments rang hollow. The jurors looked at the defense attorneys, then looked at the women on stretchers, and the contrast was impossible to ignore, too. The company's executives were not stupid. They looked at the newspaper headlines and the letters from outraged citizens. They looked at the politicians suddenly taking an interest in the case. They looked at the women in the courtroom, visibly dying, visibly sympathetic, visibly determined to see this through, no matter what it cost them. And they realized they could not win. Not in the court of public opinion, not with dying women testifying against them. A full trial, with weeks of testimony and coverage, would be a catastrophe for the company's reputation. It might even lead to criminal charges. They offered a settlement. In June 1928, after months of legal warfare and public pressure, the 5 Radium girls accepted the company's offer. Each woman would receive $10,000 in cash, approximately $175,000 in today's dollars. Each would receive an annual pension of $600 for the rest of her life. All of their medical expenses would be paid by the company. It was a fraction of what the women deserved. $10,000 for a life? For years of agony, for bodies destroyed, for futures stolen. It was an insult. But the women were dying. Grace Fryer's doctors told her she had less than a year to live. Catherine's jaw was disintegrating. Kinta couldn't get out of bed. They did not have years to wait for a trial. They did not have the strength for more legal battles. They needed the money now, for medical care, for their families, for whatever time they had left. They took the settlement because they had no choice. But they had won something more important than money. They had proven that a corporation could be held accountable for poisoning its workers. They had established that occupational disease, illness caused by the conditions of work, was a legitimate legal concept. They had shown that even the most powerful company could be brought to heel by public outrage and the courage of ordinary people. They had changed the law. The settlement's effects were immediate and far-reaching. New Jersey quickly passed new legislation requiring workplace safety protections for workers handling radioactive materials. The radium industry, not just US Radium, but all the companies that had sprung up to capitalize on the radium craze, was forced to adopt safety measures they had resisted for years. No more lip-pointing, no more unprotected exposure, no more pretending that radium was safe. Other dial painters, emboldened by the settlement, began to come forward with their own claims. Workers who had been afraid to speak now had proof that the company could be held accountable. The trickle of lawsuits became a flood, and across the country, labor activists and reformers pointed to the Radium girls as proof that workers needed protection from unscrupulous employers. The case became a rallying cry, a symbol of everything wrong with American labor law and everything that needed to change. Grace Fryer, Catherine Schaub, Edna Hussman, Quinta MacDonald, Albina Larice, these 5 women, dying in pain, abandoned by the company that had poisoned them, had done what no one thought possible. They had challenged one of the most powerful corporations in America, and they had won. Grace Fryer lived until 1933, 5 years longer than her doctors had predicted. She used her settlement money for medical care, clinging to life with the same determination she had brought to her legal fight. She followed the news, watching as other dial painters won their own settlements, as laws were passed to protect workers, as the legacy of the Radium girls spread across the country. She died on February 27th, 1933. She was 34 years old. The other New Jersey Radium girls followed her, one by one, through the 1930s. Catherine Schaub died in 1933. Quinta MacDonald died in 1929, just a year after the settlement. She barely had time to spend her money. Albina Larice died in 1946. Edna Hussman held on until 1939. None of them reached old age. None of them got to see their children grow up, or hold their grandchildren, or enjoy the peaceful retirement they had dreamed of when they first took those glamorous jobs at the Radium factory. The Radium had taken everything from them, except their courage, except their determination, except their refusal to be silenced. And that courage would continue to save lives long after they were gone. Because in Ottawa, Illinois, another group of women had been watching. They worked for a different company, the Radium Dial Company, but they had the same symptoms, the same dying jaws, the same crumbling bones. They had been told the same lies. The New Jersey settlement should have been the end of it. It should have forced every radium company in America to protect its workers, to abandon the murderous lip-pointing technique, to acknowledge the danger they had always known about. It didn't. In Ottawa, Illinois, the Radium Dial Company had watched the New Jersey case with great interest. They had learned a lesson from it, not about worker safety, not about corporate responsibility, but about how to deny, delay, and destroy evidence more effectively. A new generation of Radium girls was about to die, and this time, the fight would be even harder. While the New Jersey women were fighting their legal battle, workers at the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois, were still lip-pointing their brushes, still glowing in the dark, still being told that radium was perfectly safe. Ottawa was a small town, quiet, conservative, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the factory was the center of economic life. The Radium Dial Company was one of the largest employers in town. To work there was a privilege. To question the company was unthinkable. The company's executives had followed the New Jersey trial closely. They had seen US Radium's mistakes, the paper trail, the witnesses who could testify to the lip-pointing instruction, the damning internal documents. They were determined not to repeat those errors. They removed all written references to the dangers of radium from company files. They coached supervisors on what to say and what never to say to workers. They prepared legal defenses in advance, anticipating the lawsuits they knew would eventually come. And when workers started getting sick, they denied everything. They claimed the women had never been instructed to lip point. They claimed the illnesses had other causes. They claimed, just as US Radium had claimed, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding or a fraud or hysteria. The Illinois women were more isolated than their New Jersey counterparts. They were rural, less educated, farther from the major newspapers that had publicized Grace Fryer's case. The company calculated that they would be easier to silence, easier to ignore, easier to grind down through legal delay until they simply gave up and died. They were wrong. Catherine Wolfe Donahue was the Grace Fryer of Illinois, but her fight would be even harder, her suffering even more prolonged, her courage even more extraordinary. Catherine started at the Radium Dial Company in 1922 when she was just 19 years old. She was a good worker, fast, precise, reliable. She took pride in her dials, just as the New Jersey girls had. She got married, had children, built a life in Ottawa. By the late 1920s, she had started getting sick. The symptoms were familiar: fatigue, aching bones, dental problems that wouldn't go away. She kept working. She needed the money, and besides, the company doctor told her she was fine. It was probably nothing. It would probably clear up on its own. It didn't clear up. By the mid-1930s, Catherine could barely function. Her hip had spontaneously fractured. She was walking down the street one day and her leg simply broke beneath her. Her jaw had begun to deteriorate, the bone dying just as Molly Maggia's had died 15 years before. She knew by now what was happening. She had heard about the New Jersey women. She had read about the settlements. She knew that radium had killed her, and she decided to fight. Catherine's legal battle was even more difficult than Grace's had been. Illinois law was different from New Jersey law. Workers' compensation claims in Illinois went before the Industrial Commission, a bureaucratic body with strict procedural rules and limited sympathy for workers. The company had spent years preparing its defenses, coaching witnesses, destroying documents that might be used against it. And the Radium Dial Company was even more ruthless than US Radium had been. When Catherine filed her claim in 1934, the company fought back with everything it had. Its lawyers argued that the statute of limitations had expired. They argued that Catherine's illness had other causes. They produced witnesses who claimed, falsely, that the company had never instructed workers to lip point. When it became clear that the case might go against them, the company tried an extraordinary maneuver. It moved its operations across state lines to a new factory in New York. The goal was to complicate jurisdiction, to create legal confusion, to make it harder for the Illinois courts to hold them accountable. The delays went on for years. Catherine's condition worsened. Her jaw crumbled. Her body failed, but she refused to give up. In 1938, after 4 years of legal warfare, Catherine Donahue finally got her day in court. The hearing before the Illinois Industrial Commission was the culmination of everything Catherine had fought for. She was carried into the courtroom. She could no longer walk. Her bones were too fragile, her body too weak. She weighed less than 70 pounds. Her face was wrapped in bandages, concealing the ruins of her jaw. But she could still speak, and speak she did. She told the commissioners everything. The lip-pointing technique, the assurances that radium was safe, the company doctor who had told her she was fine even as her bones crumbled, the years of denial and delay while she and her co-workers sickened and died. At one point during the hearing, Catherine's lawyer asked her to remove the bandage from her mouth so the commissioners could see her jaw. What they saw shocked them into silence. Her jaw was essentially gone, a gaping wound where bone and flesh should have been. The commissioners could see exposed tissue, could see the destruction that radium had wrought. One of them reportedly turned away, unable to look. This was not a statistic. This was not a legal argument. This was a human being, destroyed by corporate greed, showing them the evidence with her own body. The Radium Dial Company's lawyers tried their usual tactics. They questioned Catherine's credibility. They produced their own experts. They cited procedural objections and technical arguments. It didn't work. The commissioners looked at the lawyers, then looked at Catherine, and the choice was clear. In 1938, the Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in Catherine Donahue's favor. The commission found that her illness was directly caused by her work at the Radium Dial Company. The company was ordered to pay her medical expenses and provide compensation for her injuries. More importantly, the ruling established a legal precedent. For the first time, radiation poisoning was officially recognized as an occupational disease under Illinois law. Other workers, not just dial painters, but anyone exposed to radiation on the job, now had legal recourse if they were harmed. Catherine Donahue had won. She died on July 27, 1938, just days after learning of her victory. She was 35 years old. She left behind a husband and 2 young children. She never got to spend the money she had won, never got to see her children grow up, never got to enjoy the peaceful life she had dreamed of. But her victory lived on. Catherine's case triggered a cascade of legal and legislative changes. Illinois strengthened its occupational disease laws, making it easier for workers to file claims and harder for companies to hide behind procedural technicalities. Other states followed suit. The dial painting industry, what remained of it, was finally completely reformed. Federal attention turned to the issue of workplace radiation exposure. Congress held hearings. Regulators drafted new rules. The casual attitude toward radium that had characterized the early 20th century was replaced by a growing understanding of just how dangerous radioactive materials could be. And then World War II began. The atomic age was dawning. The Manhattan Project was assembling scientists and engineers to build the most destructive weapon in human history. These scientists needed to understand radiation, how it affected the human body, how much exposure was dangerous, how to protect workers who handled radioactive materials. Where did they find this information? In the medical records of the Radium Girls. The careful documentation of how radium destroyed bone, blood, and tissue. Documentation compiled by doctors like Harrison Martland. Documentation made possible by the legal cases that forced the truth into the open, became the foundation of nuclear safety protocols. The women's suffering, grotesquely, became the data that would protect others. Their bodies, in death, saved lives. Decades after the Radium Girls died, scientists began exhuming their bodies. This was not grave robbing, this was research. Careful, necessary research into the long-term effects of radium exposure. The atomic age had created new concerns about radiation safety, and the Radium Girls' remains offered invaluable data that could not be obtained any other way. In 1968, researchers obtained permission to examine the remains of several New Jersey dial painters. What they found was shocking and grimly fascinating. The bones were still radioactive. 40 years in the grave had not diminished the radium's power. The women's skeletons still fogged photographic film. Geiger counters clicked and buzzed when held near the remains. The radium was still there, still emitting alpha particles, still doing what radium does. The measurements were staggering. Some bodies showed radium levels hundreds of times higher than any modern safety standard would allow. These women had been walking radiation sources, their own bodies bombarding their own tissue with deadly particles for years before they died. They had been dead women walking, their bodies already destroyed, long before the final symptoms appeared. In 1987, one of the last surviving Radium Girls, a woman named May Keene, donated her body to science. May had worked as a dial painter, but had escaped the worst of the poisoning. She had found the taste of the paint disgusting and had refused to lip point properly, instead wiping her brush on a rag between strokes. A small rebellion. A moment of disgust. And it had saved her life. May lived to be 107 years old, dying in 2014 as one of the last people on Earth who had known the original Radium girls as friends and co-workers. In her final years, she gave interviews about her long-dead colleagues, remembering them as they had been, young, vibrant, full of hope, glowing in the darkness of dance halls. When researchers examined her remains after her death, they found measurable radium in her bones, traces of the poison she had absorbed nearly a century before. Even her small rebellion had not completely protected her. The Argonne National Laboratory, as part of its work on nuclear safety, tracked the Radium girls and other radiation exposure victims for decades. The Center for Human Radiobiology compiled exhaustive records of the dial painters' medical histories, their exposure levels, their symptoms, their deaths. This data became crucial for setting modern radiation safety standards. The maximum permissible body burden for radium, the amount of radioactive material that can be safely absorbed by the human body, was derived directly from studying the dial painters. In other words, the women who died in agony became the baseline for protecting everyone who works with radiation today. Nuclear power plant workers, hospital radiology technicians, researchers handling radioactive materials. All of them are protected by safety standards that were written, in part, based on what happened to the Radium girls. The women's suffering was not meaningless. It was data, and that data has saved countless lives. The Radium girls' legal battles establish principles that still protect American workers today. Before their cases, occupational disease was barely recognized in American law. Workers who were poisoned by their jobs had few legal options. Employers could claim ignorance, could delay cases indefinitely, could grind down plaintiffs until they gave up or died. After the Radium girls, the landscape changed. Their cases established the right of workers to sue employers for occupational illnesses. They established that companies could not escape liability simply by claiming they didn't know their products were dangerous. They established that the health and safety of workers was not something companies could sacrifice for profit. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, was not created until 1970, decades after the Radium girls died. But the principles it embodies, the idea that workers have a right to safe workplaces, can be traced directly back to Grace Fryer and Catherine Donahue and all the women who refused to die in silence. Every time a company is held accountable for harming its workers, the Radium girls win again. Today, the Radium girls are finally being remembered. In Ottawa, Illinois, a statue was erected in 2011 depicting a dial painter at work. The inscription honors Catherine Donahue and the other Ottawa women who fought and died for justice. In Orange, New Jersey, historical markers tell the story of the original dial painting studio and the women who worked there. The building where they lip-pointed their brushes, where they swallowed poison in exchange for paychecks, still stands. Books have been written about them. Documentaries have been filmed. Plays have been performed. The story of the Radium girls has entered the American consciousness. A cautionary tale about corporate greed and worker exploitation. They are remembered, finally, as heroes, not victims, though they were victims, not martyrs, though they paid with their lives. Heroes, women who saw injustice and refused to accept it, Women who fought back when fighting back was nearly impossible. Women who lit the way for everyone who came after them. Let us count the cost. The exact number of radium girls who died from radium poisoning is unknown. Estimates range from dozens to hundreds. Many deaths were never properly attributed, blamed on syphilis, on infection, on unknown causes, because the companies that killed these women were very good at covering their tracks. What we know for certain is this: young women, some still teenagers, were poisoned by their employers with full knowledge of the danger. When they got sick, they were blamed. When they died, they were slandered. When they fought back, they were told they had no case, no chance, no hope. They fought anyway. The cost was measured in lives cut short, in children who grew up without mothers, in families destroyed by grief, in bodies that betrayed their owners in the most horrifying ways imaginable. The cost was measured in years of agony, in jaws that rotted away, in bones that crumbled, in blood that wouldn't clot, in pain that no medication could touch. The cost was incalculable, and the companies that inflicted it got away with paying a fraction of what they owed. Let us speak their names. Molly Maggia, 24 years old, the first to die, branded a syphilis victim to protect her killer's profits. She deserved better. She deserved so much better. Grace Fryer, the fighter, the organizer, the woman who spent 2 years searching for a lawyer, who never gave up, who refused to let the truth be buried. She was 34 when she died, and she had accomplished more than most people manage in twice that time. Catherine Schulb, Grace's cousin, who took the job on Grace's recommendation. Grace carried that guilt to her grave. Catherine never blamed her. Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice, sisters who worked together, suffered together, fought together. They died within years of each other, but they were together until the end. Catherine Donahue, the mother who was carried into court because she couldn't walk, who showed her ruined jaw to the commissioners, who won her case and died days later. She was 35. Her children grew up without her. Hazel Vincent Cusa, Irene Rudolph, Sarah Melifer, Marguerite Carloch, Peg Looney, Charlotte Purcell, Ella Cruz, Marie Rossiter, Helen Quinlan. The list goes on. Each name is a life. Each name is a person who had hopes and dreams and people who loved them. Each name is an accusation against the companies that killed them and the society that let it happen. Say their names. They deserve to be remembered. The story of the Radium Girls is not ancient history. It is not a tale from a distant past that has no relevance to our world today. It is a warning. The Radium Girls were killed by a simple equation. Their lives were worth less than the cost of protecting them. The companies did the math. They calculated what it would cost to implement safety measures, to provide protective equipment, to stop the lip-pointing technique. Then they calculated what it would cost to defend lawsuits from dying workers. The second number was smaller, so they made their choice. That equation has not disappeared. It exists today, wherever corporations calculate whether it's cheaper to pay lawsuits than to fix problems. It exists wherever workers are told that safety concerns are overblown, that protective measures are unnecessary, that everything is fine. It exists wherever profit is placed above people. The Radium Girls remind us what happens when we forget that workers are human beings, not line items on a balance sheet. They remind us that corporations will not protect workers out of the goodness of their hearts. They will protect workers because the law requires it, because unions demand it, because the public outcry would be too damaging to ignore. They remind us that the fight for worker safety is never truly won. It must be fought again and again, generation after generation, because there will always be companies willing to sacrifice human lives for profit, and there must always be people willing to stand up and say no. But the Radium Girls are more than a cautionary tale. They are a story of courage. Think about what they did. Dying women, women who could barely walk, women whose jaws were rotting away, women in constant, unimaginable pain, dragged themselves into courtrooms to testify. They faced down armies of corporate lawyers. They endured years of delay and denial and character assassination. They refused to be silenced. They could not save themselves. By the time they realized what had been done to them, it was too late. The radium was in their bones, and nothing could remove it. But they could save others. They could make sure that no one else would suffer what they had suffered. They could change the law, change the culture, change the way America thought about workers and their rights. And they did. Every worker who comes home safe from a job site today owes something to the Radium Girls. Every regulation that protects employees from toxic exposure traces back to their sacrifice. Every time a corporation is held accountable for harming its workers, the Radium Girls win again. They glowed in the dark. They were the ghost girls, the shining girls, creatures of light and magic in the dance halls of a vanished America. And the light they left behind still illuminates the path to justice. It shines in every courtroom where a worker sues a negligent employer. It shines in every legislative chamber where safety regulations are debated. It shines in every workplace where someone says, "This isn't safe," and someone else listens. The Radium Girls are gone. Their bones still glow in their graves, will glow for thousands of years to come, a permanent memorial to what was done to them. But the light they created, the light of courage and justice and refusal to be silenced, that light will never fade. The story of the Radium Girls raises questions we still grapple with today. How much responsibility do corporations bear for worker safety? When do we believe the company? And when do we believe the workers? How do we prevent the next industrial tragedy before it happens? What do you think? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, if you believe the dead deserve their voices heard, subscribe and hit the bell, because the archives are deep and there are more stories waiting to be told. Thank you for watching.